Yo, how you been? It's been a while. Got a very special occasion, finally doing another video, and what I am going to be doing a series of videos on is the Garnet, the Pro L190-D. Not many people know much about Garnets. I certainly don't. What I can find on the internet is confusing. What I do know, they're made in Canada, were made in Canada. My guess this amp is from the 70s. I got this amp from a good friend who gave it to me to have, to love, to hold. I'm going to call him George because I can't say still. That's good. Because I can't say Sylvester, George. Tell me where that's from. At any rate, we're going to try to figure out what's going on here, because from what I can see on the internet, from schematics and such, this specific amp doesn't seem to fit. So if you want to come along with me on the journey, see what we can find out. It certainly needs some servicing. There's at minimum going to be a cap job. We'll talk more about that later. I've done a tiny bit of work. I've had this amp for a while. A lot of the work was actually cleaning it up. It was completely covered with mold. I may have mold or dirt. I may have some pictures of that I'll flash on the screen. I actually have already installed a 3-prong cord, but I don't like what I did, so I'm going to change that. It does need to be recapped, and there's something else wrong with this amp. But if it sounds interesting, you want to learn more about this really cool amp, come along for the ride. Okay, here's a closer look at the front panel of this amp. First of all, let me say a couple things about the amp. This is a 2x6 CA7 output tube amplifier, single channel. So 6CA7 being very close or equivalent to an EL34. Let's say the 6CA7 is an American version. Effectively, they can be used interchangeably. So this is going to be, or is about, anywhere to a 40 to 50 watt amp, depending on how it's biased, how it's set up. It is a fixed bias amp, but what probably makes this amp more interesting than most, or really cool, is it actually has a extra gain stage effectively in the amp that's provided with a triode pentode miniature tube. Similar to a 7199, this specific amp uses a 6AN8 tube, which has both a little triode in it and a pentode. And that is where we come to the really coolly named Stinger circuit. So this Stinger circuit here, there is color, which I'm assuming is tone. I got to take a closer look at the schematics, or take a closer look inside the amp. And volume. Okay. So that is a gain volume, because you do see the main amp volume there. So that's for this. Effectively, you can turn it on or off, this Stinger switch. Stinger circuit, I should say, which is basically an extra gain. And I believe this foot switch, I'm going to guess, is to use a foot switch to turn it on and off. So sort of like a boost. And if we got 2 inputs, it's only 1 channel from what I can see, and it's really coolly named the sound fountain area, which includes volume, but volume looks push-pull switches on all of these. Kind of cool. So there's a treble, a bass, and a volume, in addition to the gain for the Stinger. So I'm imagining if the Stinger preamp stage is disengaged with off, that the only control for volume will be this volume knob. And then otherwise these will work interactively. So higher gain, lower volume, maybe more breakup, we'll see. Hopefully once we get it working. So there's a treble with a pull for rock. Not sure what that is. Obviously it's probably going to kick in a different capacitor sort of filter for the, and similarly for the bass. That could potentially be kicking in and out a bypass capacitor on one of the stages, maybe. I don't know. Got to take a closer look. And then this push-pull on the volume, more than likely is for, at lower volumes, will provide a treble cap, which bypasses the volume, so allowing all of the treble signal before the volume to go around and continue through the circuit without attenuation. So now what's really cool about this amp is there's these little lights, well, seems like LEDs are in there, something's happening. Not sure if that turns on or off when these are push-pulled, maybe to show that the rock and bright is engaged. I don't know, we'll see. And then down at this end, we've seen amps that have speed LEDs with the speed of the modulation of the volume. But that's cool, but not unheard of. But this one, I'm very eager to see what that is. Will that show the depth? This looks like there's a light behind there, so that this gets more intense. Does it blink along at the same rate as the speed? We're going to find out, hopefully, once we get this working. Okay, so that's the front of the amp. Okay, nothing interesting really back here on the back of the amp. We've got a fuse. We've got actually a strain relief cord. We've got a fuse holder, 3 amps, a ground reverse, which I have defeated already. Actually, I worked on this amp a year ago and kind of walked away from it. Power on, off, and a standby. We'll see how those are set up. There's the nameplate. And once again, if I zoom in maybe, if you take a look at that nameplate, this is an L190-D. It's not an LB. I can find some schematics that refer to this, but they don't seem to show what's in this amp. I've been in this amp before and have an idea. So we're going to see. And then we have your typical speaker connection and an extension cabinet connection. I believe these are wired in parallel. I believe this amp is set up at 1 impedance, and that would be 8 ohms. And there you go. So that would, you could connect 2 16 ohm cabinets at the same time for 8 ohm impedance total, or just one at 8, I believe. We'll double check that. Okay, one thing I want to show while we have this here, and you can kind of see it. If you look, let's see, can I do that? If you look at the fasteners, now I'm going to remove the head from the amp. There are screws that go through the chassis that hold it. I'll show you that. But there are also these panels, both on the front and the back, that need to be removed. They require this thing, a square socket, an S2 size square tip socket. There's probably a clinical name for it. I don't know what it is. You need to use that to remove these. These seem to be brass screws, so they're soft. If you try to jam in something, you know, maybe you can get a flat screwdriver that's exactly the correct width of the hypotenuse of the square, or the diagonal in the square, and that could probably work. One little interesting thing about the amp case itself is there is no handle on the top, what I would call the top of the amp. There are handles on each side, and the feet are there on the bottom of the amp. So, very interesting. It's meant to be carried, I guess, maybe with both hands. It's not that heavy of an amp. One thing, these Canadian amps, that reminds me of a trainer is the size of the transformers, and a lot of good iron on here. But this is still not a ridiculously heavy amp. So I don't think you need 2. You can probably just hold it by the 1. Anyway, I just thought that was kind of interesting. Both the back and front panels to remove the amp. The amp itself can only slide out the back. Let me turn this around, I'll show you why I say that. If we take a look at the front, where that panel is that's going to come out, and the reason, by the way, you're taking off these panels is to access the nuts that hold the chassis into the head. Because you would not be able to access this. If you look here, the width of the edge in the front is larger. This width is larger than it is in the back, and the amp will not come out this way. The chassis of the actual amp itself will hit the side, so it'll come out the back. All right, I'm going to go and do that. I won't bore you with that, but I just wanted to show you that and make it clear that you need to remove both of those. Let me just show you. Otherwise, you cannot reach those nuts to get them off. You can't really go in through the back. At least I can't with my hands to get any kind of angle on them. They're square nuts, so that you need a wrench to do it at first, at least to hold them, and that's nearly impossible to do with not taking off this panel and doing it from the front. When you do that, I'm going to do it. I'm going to turn this over, by the way. First, remove all the tubes, which I have already, and then I will slide it out the back. Okay, the chassis is out, but I wanted to show you something first. Now, there's the tube chart that's inside, and you'll see there's the 6AU6, two 12AX7s, the 6AN8. What's interesting, it has a 6SN7, and as we'll see, that's actually the phase used as a phase inverter tube. That is an octal dual triode, very similar to specifications to a 12AX7, I believe. Yes, the SN is about 100 gain, I believe. I could stand corrected. I'm pausing to put something across the screen in case I am. And there's the dual 6CA7s. One of the things, as I had mentioned, this seems to be a unique amp, and or I cannot find a specific schematic that reflects exactly what this amp is that 6AN8 tube that's underneath this shield here. I actually went in and labeled where the tubes are. What's interesting about that is that I've seen other similar amps, and some are LB190s, which I imagine is the base version, but they show a 6J, what is that tube? I think I have, they show a 6JW8, which is a similar tube to the AN8, but not that tube. I'm going to have to go in, and I am certain that this is the right tube for the amp, not only on the tube chart, which could be wrong, of course, but the fact is I believe these are all the original tubes that were in this amp from when my buddy had it, and they all match in brand. But at any rate, so as you can see, for a couple of things that jump out when I look at this amp, now that it's out, is that it has these shields work okay. They actually are very tight to the tube. And what they do, there are prongs here that they sort of hold into and hold the tube in place. One could argue that maybe they dissipate heat because they actually are so close, and metal dissipates heat better than glass. So it's transferred from the glass to the metal and then radiates better. I don't know. See these in a lot of Canadian amps and other amps. So it's not a surprise. Do I like them? They seem to scratch the surface of the stenciling on the tubes. That's why I don't like them. Here's the 6AN. They're labeled Garnet. I have an X on it because this tube is actually bad. I'll get into that later when I did power this up originally, what I found. Labeled Garnet, so I am certain that that is that. And then we have a 12AX7. I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit as I take these out. What's interesting about this amp, and when you look at the schematic too and look at how it's wired, these 12AX7s, commonly found in amps. By the way, you want to take the shield off first and then wiggle the tube out. Sometimes if the shield is tight, everything comes out. What are you going to do? This is a replacement, but what's interesting, these two 12AX7s in the circuit, only one half of each of these triodes is used. You wondered, it's still, maybe when I take a closer look, it becomes apparent why they just didn't use one and use both sides. Who knows? So here we are, and this is the 6AU6, commonly used in many amps as for the tremolo circuit. It is a pentode, single pentode tube, very common. Good tube, actually can be used often in preamps. By the way, this 6AN8 is what drives that Stinger circuit. Another thing that jumps out when I look at this amp, I turn it over, obviously there are 5 filter capacitor cans, or what I imagine are for filtering, and they are, to do a little spoiler. Okay. But there's something interesting when you look at those. You see 2 of them have these cardboard insulation, then you can actually see that they're insulated from the actual chassis itself. That immediately tells me, very likely, that these are the top half of series connections. In other words, the outside of the cans are typically the common ground, but if these are in series, then that common ground, or that negative side of the capacitor, is actually at high potential. And my guess is, and I'll get a little spoiler alert, I was correct in guessing this, but this is something, when you look at these amps, something should jump out. When you see this, that tells you there may be danger, particularly when you see insulation. Now, there's other reasons why capacitors may be insulated from the chassis, but when you see these covers, almost always it's because there is a shock hazard. And as we'll see, since these have the same value, these are, I believe, 350 volt at 350 volts, and they are 80 microfarads. So are the ones that are covered if you look at the schematic, and you'll see that these 2 are actually pairs. These 2 are paired. This is this will go to, this can is grounded. The top lead, the positive lead, is actually connected to the ground side of this capacitor, and the top lead is what is carrying the high voltage. So this is, let's say the amp is running at 500 volts at the B+1 node, or first node, the A node, then that means that this, if this was lifted off, this insulation, and you touch it, you'd get 250 volts DC. Nice little surprise. So that's something to look for in any amp. Whenever you see these, there is a very specific reason why they're done like that. It's not just for show. See those in amp. I've seen a lot. And what it is typically they're the highest B node, B+ node, DC node in the amps. And at least back then, and certainly to some degree today, the voltage is so high that it goes beyond the capacitor spec. So these are put in series to split that voltage. So 2 300 volt capacitors in series provide 700 volts from bottom to top. It can handle up to 700 volts. Basically, each one is splitting that voltage in half, 350. So that's why they did that. You see there's a multi-can there, and my guess is that these capacitors are for the lower portions of the B+ rail, and they are. Another thing I just see, maybe get a closer look, bounce around. These are a nice heavy power transformer here. It's got a little bit of melty going on. Hopefully that's not a problem. It's not unusual. I've seen a hell of a lot worse than that for amps that have been running for years and continue running well. Got a nice power transformer. It looks beautiful. That old school, let's see if I can get a good shot of that old, almost Art Deco Hammond logo on that. I haven't dated this amp yet. I've got to take a look at some of the components inside. See if we can find some pots with some dates and see some other evidence of when this amp was made. Once again, I believe it's from the 70s, early 70s probably. Don't know. We're going to find out. All right, so that's the outside. Okay, here we are on the other side of the amp, on the inside. First thing that jumps out to me about this amp, and I'll get closer handheld looks at this, is that this is actually a true, for the most part, point-to-point wired amp. Very rare to see them at this kind of wattage. In other words, there is no circuit board. When you take a look at an old Fender, and you take, or an old Marshall has a turret board where components are attached and then wiring goes to those components. And the old Fenders, there are rivet boards. And in this amp, you don't see that anyway. Well, one exception is this board here, and this basically is the rectifier, the high tension rectifier that supplies the smoothed out voltage to the B plus rail, and also on here is the bias circuit. But other than that, there are no boards. There are various different terminal strips, but everything is wired on strips and or at the components. You'll see components that are wired directly to the tube sockets, to jacks. We're going to take a closer look. We're going to look at some very interesting things in the amp. Well, one thing I think we can continue to look at from this high level is you see, well, we saw that there was a power transformer and an output transformer outside on the amp, but now we see two transformers inside. Say, well, first of all, this amp does not have reverb, so you might have thought maybe one of them was a reverb. One could be a choke. The choke is part of the filtering system from AC to DC. You'll hear things such as pi filters, etc. And in fact, I'll just jump ahead and tell you that this is a filter choke. You see them inside amps quite often. So that is attached to the B plus rail, but what is this other? And interestingly, metal there's metal around it. There's three lines coming from it. Well, if you look at the schematic, you'll see that this is actually the phase inverter. This is part of the phase inverter circuit. It is a transformer-driven phase inverter circuit. So in other words, this is where the 6SN7 comes in and functions as a phase inverter, but the signal is split and delivered to the output tubes through a transformer that's similar in some ways to the output transformer, where it is center tapped and each side provides a different phase, the opposite phase as the other. Very good phase inversion system. The reason why it's not used in many amps, in hardly any amps, you see them in Gibson sometime, is that it's expensive. This is much more expensive to set up than a long tail pair even, which is probably the next most expensive, because as the most components, it takes two sides of a tube, or certainly it's more expensive than a cathodyne phase inverter, which uses only one tube and only just a handful or less of components to provide phase inversion. But it's not as evenly, each side is not as even, and there's other issues with those, or can distort quicker. So that's going to be interesting. Another thing you see here, now this is interesting. What am I going to, let's jump ahead a little bit here. What am I going to do with this amp? Well, I know for certain I'm going to recap this amp. And I've got to make a decision here. These are in fact, you can see where the insulation is. These are 80 microfarad capacitors, 350 volt in series, that provide the filtering to the first node, filtering to the second node, another pair in series, and then the third, fourth, and fifth node through the fourth and fifth and sixth node, actually, through there, through this multicam. So I can replace these all with similar. The 80 microfarad single cans are not really available. A good alternative is what you'll see often. Let's see if I have any old ones here somewhere. I might, making a lot out of me. Here we go. That are found in Marshalls and similar. Marshalls will have 100 and 100 in series. By the way, 80 and 80 provides 40 microfarads of filtering. So 100 and 100, if I replace this with 100 and 100, which are kind of available, that would provide 50, which is fine. It's close enough. As a matter of fact, here's one I think this was out of a Marshall, I think. And you can see actually it's two 50 ohm, 50 microfarad capacitors, and these can be connected in parallel to provide 100 ohms. So I have a choice here. I can replace each of these 80s with something like this, with two 50s. They're readily available because they're often used in Marshalls, and wire them in parallel here, and then another one here wired in parallel, and then these two in series. By the way, these are voltage divider resistors, 220K, 2 watt, that are part of the circuit. Some people call them bleeder resistors. That's a function that they serve, but that is not what they are. Their main function is to, in this circuit that is a series connection of capacitors, they are wired also in series in parallel with the capacitor, and they provide a constant voltage division between each side for each capacitor, because you don't want something to happen in the circuit, or if one goes and the other one drifts, then voltages become different across these and may exceed the capacitor's specification. That's what these are really for. Now, they do serve when the amp is turned off to bleed voltage off of the B plus rail to ground, because they are connected to ground. But sorry for that tangent. So I've got a decision. I can replace these that way. I can replace this can also. A couple of things with that in mind is, one, I'd have to see, you can see how this hole here for this capacitor that is insulated and insulated from the board, that has the common ground, is actually at high voltage in series with this one. You can see that the hole is larger and this hole here is smaller. And these twist lock type capacitor cans are actually twist locked and connected to ground to the chassis from those. So there's a difference here. These type of capacitors that are readily available are not twist locks. So will they fit? There's holes here. I would have to remove this insulator. These are insulated and require a clamp to hold them on the other side of the amp. I don't have this one open enough. So I'd have to be able to mount this on the other side of the amp through those holes, but this one doesn't have that. And similarly, I can replace this here. Another thing with this, that particularly these capacitor cans, these multi-cans, are very expensive, relatively speaking, to discrete components. In this amp, I can take, here is an FNT 100 microfarad, 300 volt capacitor. I can wire two of these in series. There's a lot of space here. Can I somehow mount these? Here's one's here for this one, replace that. And then the 47, these are 40s and 20s here, but let's just use 40s just for illustration's sake. I can somehow mount them here. Can I place a turret board? Can I maybe even build a rivet board? Because there will be, I don't want to leave holes, or do I leave those capacitors there? I have all the parts on order, on their way, that I can do it either way. So that's going to be a big decision I've got to make on this amp. Let's point out a couple other things that are going to be replaced in addition to the filter capacitors. You can see these are bypass caps. There are one, I don't know if you can see it, two, and there's one down here, three. And as you can see, since it is point-to-point wired, they are wired right onto the actual sockets themselves. They're going to need to be replaced. Those are old electrolytics. And by the looks of them, by the way, this looks like an early 70s amp. These are very common components in trainers, which are Canadian also. So, and I've serviced quite a few of those that are about that age that look like these parts. Also these yellow box capacitors. They're good. I don't expect otherwise, by the way, that I'm going to have any issues with any of the components. The only other areas I'm going to look, when I replace the filter capacitors, I probably will replace these voltage divider resistors. And if you look here on this board is the bias circuit. I may take a look at that. This reverse electrolytic capacitor, which is the filter capacitor and bias circuit, I will probably replace that. And also, just in general, there is a lot of great room, a lot of great acreage here. What I plan to do is also move this bias circuit off of this board or use it partially and set up somewhere a little setup that I can create an adjustable bias circuit. What else is interesting to see in this amp? Here are those push-pull. I don't know if you can see that. You can actually see there is, you know what, I'm going to get the handheld so you can see how these work. These are great. I love these switches, these push-pull type of switches. They're the best ones. All right, let's see if we get a better look at these push-pull pots with the switches. There. So we're looking at the middle one here. This is the base. What you'll see is that through the shaft actually goes through the pot itself and extends to basically what is this circle in here is the actual switch. And that, by moving that, flips the contacts back and forth. Can you see that? Get that going. Kind of neat. So all three have that. Let's see if I can get a better idea. By the way, in the amp, I do not see any evidence of anything being changed. And here it looks like all the solder joints are original, with the exception of what I did back here with removing the polarity switch and all that earlier, which I'm going to redo some. I'm going to redo the ground structure, but that's for another video. So it looks all original to me. Let me see if I get a closer look to date things. Oh, one other thing I don't want to overlook is the stinger circuit has a separate sort of shielding going on there. Behind there is the wiring to not only the stinger but the input itself. So some extra shielding to the input section. I think it's probably more than the actual stinger circuit. So that's nice. Well built amp, I guess I could say overall. By looking at the pots, it's really tough to get. I can't get any angle at any codes. I'll try harder. I'll also take a look at the transformers a little closer to see if I can get some dating, and or any other components that may carry a date. But my guess this would be early 70s. All right, I think that pretty much sums it up for this video. This is just the initial. I'm really excited about this amp. There was a problem that I will mention in startup of this amp that I'll mention in the next videos. It may not just be a recap situation. We shall see. That's the cliffhanger. All right, thanks.